Hi, everybody. My name is Zhang Mei, and I'm the founder of WildChina. Good to see old friends in Zoom and new friends in Clubhouse. This event, for the first half, it is recorded on Zoom. There won't be any Q&A from the audience, but in the second half, we will move to Clubhouse. And so if you have questions, save till then. But for those friends in Zoom, if you have questions, please feel free to put in the chat box. Okay, so welcome. This is our 74th event. Unbelievable. If you've been a longtime follower of WildChina's virtual events, you know we host a monthly club, book club, and read a book every month. This book, Land of Big Numbers, was actually for April, but since all China went on 1 week holiday, so we are taking 1 week a little bit later. And I'm very excited to have Te-Ping joining us today from her home in Philadelphia, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
Welcome. And so if you haven't read the book, don't worry. There's always Amazon right there you can buy. And I would highly encourage you to take a read. It's truly a very interesting read. Land of Big Numbers. It is a collection of short stories, all featuring lives in China. And for me, it's a little bit like a sci-fi-esque sort of more than the other China fiction stories, if you would forgive me. And Te-Ping has this very, very unique voice that is very gentle, but she touches on some very big topics. And I think it's very interesting. I was talking to my colleague Kendra before this. At different age group or different experience with China, when you read the book, you have a completely different take of the book. I'm sure Te-Ping can tell us more about it a little bit. So I highly recommend it. It's a must read. Before we start, let me say a few words about Te-Ping, and I'm sure we'll hear more about her background. She was born and grew up in Oakland, which is very near where I am now, and first traveled and visited China in 2006 as part of a study abroad program at Brown University, where she was doing her undergrad. And she then went on to spend a year in China as a Fulbright scholar, Fulbright fellow, before taking a position as a foreign correspondent for Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong and then Beijing. She is now based in Philadelphia, as we just mentioned, as a journalist for the Journal. And so we'll hear more how her China background influenced this book. Right? And so we touched on some of the logistics. It's mostly going to be a Q&A, so we will just jump straight in. Welcome, Te-Ping. It's good to see you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to hang out with everyone.
Let me see. I just muted my Clubhouse voice so that we don't hear the echo there. I will start because I read your book, and as I was reading, a story popped up on my screen. So I'm going to start with that. Allow me to share a portion of my screen, and it's part of a story. This picture, can you all see this piece of fruit right there? And this is actually happened 2 weeks ago on Bloomberg News, and this is a new tomato. It says, it's better than a strawberry. People bought more than 100 pounds of it. And how delicious is it? It's this sort of sweet and sour, tingling to the tongue, and it slides straight down to your stomach like some spring water. And this is a new fruit in China. And as I was reading that, I was just reading your story in your book, right? I think that story is called New Fruit. So my question there is, how much of your fiction is real and how much is sort of fiction? Tell us, was there a fruit that inspired this specific story?
So the answer is yes, there was a very specific fruit that inspired the story. And that whole story really was inspired by the neighborhood where I lived in Beijing when I was a correspondent with the Journal there, with the Wall Street Journal. For those who know Beijing, it's sort of the Beijingqiao area, and there was this hutong that was always really lively, like packed with retirees and young mothers and dogs running around, and lots of fruits and vegetables. And in the summer, it was just the most magical nectarines would come in from the countryside, and they were intoxicating and delicious, and also maybe slightly there's a feeling sometimes in China, when you're eating something, you're not necessarily sure that what you're eating is what you're eating, right? Obviously, there's been a lot of questions around food chain supply issues, and so I remember friends telling me, because I was addicted to this fruit, saying, there's something unnatural about them, right? Like they probably inject them full of stuff. And I don't know about that, but I was addicted to them. And that was kind of the kernel that led to the story New Fruit, in which a fruit with almost supernatural properties appears in a Beijing neighborhood, very much like the one where I lived, and starts to transform people's lives in ways big and small. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that story, the writing of the story and sort of the way that it took form in many ways, I mean, it's similar to a lot of stories in the collection. I think I could point to really any story in the book, whether it's, the farmer who wants to build an airplane, to the government bureaucrat gambling in the stock market, and show you, many, many moments that, maybe there were conversations I overheard, or they were snippets of headlines that I ran across as a reporter, or details that were sort of stowed away in my notebook and never used, but, managed to find life in some of these stories.
So you hear these stories as you go about your daily life, or you travel for a story, you write them in your notebook, and how do they just become a story later on? Do you just think about it in your head? What was the process like?
Yeah, I mean, some of them really were, it could be based around like an image, something that I had just had trouble walking away from in my mind. As a reporter, of course, you're constantly talking with people and traveling and exposed to so much. In China, of course, I mean, it's just like, it's so many stories, right? And you feel, or I felt certainly, like this real sense of urgency, to try and share and communicate, which is of course my job, or was my job when I was based there with the paper. And yet also feeling at the same time, like, stories that I was able to write, often in sort of short 800-word dispatches, were only capturing a fraction of the country, right? And wanting, just feeling like really this urgency and desire to write down what I was seeing around me. And some of the stories, they might start with something like an image, right? Like there's I'm thinking of, for example, in Gubeko's Spirit, the story that closes out the book, it was an image of just, I had been riding the subway one day and just thought, what would happen if we got stuck, right? And sort of following, and following, I'd written a lot of stories at that point about the Beijing subway and public transportation in China,
Yeah.
and how it's really sort of, in many ways, this contested space where the government's always trying to civilize people's behavior, and they pipe in classical music, or have over the years, to try and encourage more civilized behavior. I wrote one story about this competition the city had to find the city's best behaving public transportation rider. On buses and subways, they scoured, all the districts in Beijing to find the most well-behaved subway rider. It's just this fascinating space, right? And so, and I think there are so many, living in China, I mean, there's so many worlds that you encounter as a reporter and that get unlocked. And just, I think for me, it was sometimes exploring, sort of a question like that. And sometimes also just, wanting to explore another side of a story, or characters that I felt like I had encountered sometimes in my reporting and just were so deeply fascinated by, and just, wanting to kind of go back from the moment that I met them, and try and rewind and understand more what brought them to where they were. And I mean, I think that these really are stories that just capture so much of the stories that I stories that maybe weren't exactly journalism, but still felt really human and important, and like they demanded telling.
I wish I could sort of just follow your mind, sort of from the image to the formation of the story. Now, next, I'm going to ask you, if you may, I see the book behind you,
Sure.
if I may, could you read a paragraph for us, just give some of the readers who have not read it a little flavor, and tell us why you chose the paragraph. While you're choosing that, a few words for our friends on Clubhouse. It seems a little bit strange that Te-Ping's voice is piped through via Kendra's phone. We have some slight technical challenge there, but Te-Ping will sign into Clubhouse in about half an hour. So just be patient. And the first half is just, we'll talk about the book anyway. Okay, go ahead. Te-Ping, back to you.
Okay, well, I'm just going to start with the start of the book. This is the story that opens the collection. It's about a pair of twins whose lives take very different paths. One who becomes a professional video gamer, that's the brother who narrates the story. And then we also follow his sister, who is a brilliant young woman whose life takes a turn. The hour of our birth had been carefully forecast, a winter's day cesarean, timed to coincide with Dr. Feng's lunch break. The doctor pulled me out first, indignant, squalling, like a hotel guest inexpertly roused and tossed before checkout. She came next and was so perfectly quiet that at first they worried she wasn't breathing at all. Then they thwacked her on the back and her cries joined mine, and they laid us side by side, boy and girl, two underwater creatures suddenly forced to fill our lungs with cold, dry air. Dr. Feng had operated on my mother as a favor to my uncle, his old classmate. Otherwise, we would have been born in the hospital down the street, where a woman had bled to death after a botched cesarean the previous year. The family had been in the waiting room for hours, and at last the father-to-be pounded on the doors of the operating room. When no one responded, the family pushed them open to find the lifeless woman on the table, blood pooling on the ground. She was alone. The staff had stripped the medical certificates that had borne their names from the wall and fled as soon as the surgery went wrong. From the start, we were lucky, not least because we had each other. As twins, we'd been spared the reach of the government's family planning policies, two waking fetuses floating in utero. For the first few weeks of our life, our skulls had matching indentations from where they'd been pressed against each other in the womb, like two interlocking puzzle pieces. Later in life, when we were apart, I'd sometimes touch my hand to the back of my skull when I thought of her, as if seeking a phantom limb. And it goes from there.
I remember that. I love the image of the puzzle sort of pressed against each other. Beautiful writing. Why did you choose this paragraph to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, it opens the collection, and it's a story. I mean, speaking of what we were just talking about, you were sort of asking about process and how these stories come to life. And even just, in those 3 paragraphs that I read, I mean, I can see clearly, like there was a moment in there, it talks about this detail of a C-section that had gone wrong and the medical staff that had fled and taken their certificates down from the wall. And that was something that, was inspired by a conversation I'd had with a Beijing guy a long time ago about a similar sort of, it wasn't a birth in that case, it was actually a case of plastic surgery that had gone wrong, but it was the same like really vivid incident in which, something had gone badly wrong. They'd taken the certificates and just fled. And it was something that, in a moment tells you so much about a society. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a lot of what you see woven into these stories.
Yes, absolutely. That's the sense I get. Like just a couple of scene setting paragraphs say so much about the country, the texture, the fabric that people build their lives on. It's really interesting. Struck me very deeply as well. Talking about scene setting, actually, I want to ask you about place setting. I grew up in Yunnan, in the south, yeah. But John and I lived in Beijing for many years as well. And as I was reading your book, I tried very hard to place your story. You know where I'm headed. Oh, of course. So I tried to place the stories in a particular city. I was like, is this Beijing, Shanghai, Xiamen? And I noticed your choice of details are almost sort of universally endearingly China. Yeah, but very hard to place geographically, right? Like one of the example is the line from New Fruit. I really enjoyed it. It says, often she, you're referring to Peng Ayi and Lao Zhou, could now be found chatting in the market, lingering over the cauliflower and long beans, right? That cauliflower and long beans, very Chinese, but universally available. Was this a conscious decision?
Yeah. It's a really good question. So it was. There were certain stories like Hotline Girl is, that's the story of the young woman who works in a government call center, satisfaction center, and gets these phone calls from her ex-boyfriend. That one set is sort of in a near future Beijing, like city. And then of course the story about the woman who works in the flower shop and has this interaction and sort of this episode with her customer that is set very much in Shanghai. But most of the other stories, I mean, are really, the location is not as specific. And I think that's partly, there's a number of reasons. One of which I think just as a journalist, I feel like in some ways, if I was to very specifically place it in a certain city, I would feel almost an obligation to make it really accurate and very much about the city and structured in a certain way and placed in a place where, and the city would perhaps be more of a character where, in the way it is in New Fruit, for example, which is very much a story. It's a very Beijing story. Yes. Shanghai, the city is almost like the third party in that relationship between the customer and this young woman working in the flower shop. They loom really large. Whereas for me, the specifics of the second or third tier city where certain stories are set wasn't what was in the foreground or felt like it was in the foreground. And to me, it was much more about the characters. And so that's why, just for my own sort of sanity in writing the stories, like I was trying to write them in a more in a more holistic, universal way that wasn't necessarily attached to, this is Luoyang, this is Xinjiang, even though I might have had scenes from certain cities in my mind, but as I was writing them, I was not thinking specifically, okay, this is a story about X city, because in my mind, like, I think then it would be, needing to really make it about a city and a place when it was really much more about, characters and themes.
Yes. Yeah, very clearly, like I could place it somewhere, but just not specifically name it.
Yeah, I mean, I just found it kind of distracting as a writer, and really as a reader too, I think in some ways. And so I was trying to avoid that.
I like that. I like that. Well, I work in travel, so in my mind, it's like I'm trying to draw out the characters of each city desperately. So
I mean, there were definitely mental maps that I was covering, but I didn't want to necessarily put them at the forefront.
Yeah, very interesting. Also, a specific question about the names. You decided to use Chinese names, Chinese spelling. It's difficult, right? It's hard to pronounce. It's hard to remember. It's sometimes like difficult to relate to. What was the decision-making process on that?
It seemed like, I mean, there was no decision because you just had to. I mean, it's a book that is almost entirely set in China, and it just would have been completely artificial to give, to do anything different. Yeah.
But there are many authors writing about China decide to give the Chinese characters English names.
I guess so. Or use
Max or something.
Yeah. It just would have felt so strange. I mean, like, in the writing of these stories, it was really, again, just pulling so much from the conversations and sort of mental story bank in my head and in the years that I'd spent in China, and to suddenly start popping in English names felt really artificial and strange. And I should also say, I mean, it's funny, when people ask me about the book and sort of the process and was I thinking about ways to make it more relatable, I mean, I will say, like, I had no idea these stories would ever be published. And so I wasn't thinking, okay, is this going to make it more readily parsable for a Western audience? I mean, for me, I was really writing these stories out of a feeling of just like this, again, this, that I had just spent so much time in a country accumulating detail and, and being so struck by what was around me and wanting to bring it to life and just writing it down almost as like this catharsis. And so I wasn't mercifully was not thinking about questions of like, well, will readers at some point, relate to this better if this character's Jenny? And fortunately wasn't feeling plagued by those sorts of questions.
No, I like the way you sort of wrote about the characters and their lives just as a very normal, relatable life, without sort of stepping back and say, well, in China, markets look like this. You didn't do any of that, which and
I loved getting, also as a journalist, I love getting to write in that way when I'm not having to like back up 3 paragraphs and explain, well, here's my footnote. And because I think, like, for example, in the story Flying Machine, about that set in a village, not a village that is readily identifiable. But it's one that, like the reader encounters funeral strippers. And it's this phenomenon that, of course, the reader from distance is like, whoa, there's a funeral and they're inviting a stripper to try and generate more turnout. And this is a phenomenon that objectively, like, if you've never encountered it, is very strange and also, very real. It was grounded on, something that happens more commonly in Chinese, sort of in rural areas. But anyway, it's the sort of thing that in a news story, you'd have to explain some of the sort of history context, the government trying to crack down on these sorts of things and all of the sociological sort of underpinnings. But in fiction, you can present the world and just let the reader, feel as though they're happening across the scene themselves. They're walking into this funeral, they're seeing it. And I don't need to be so literal. And I can let also the readers, let them build this world in their own mind without so much handholding.
And how's the audience response so far? I'm sure you've heard a lot from your audience. They immediately just jump into the scene without.
Yeah, I mean, that's been like, I mean, there's been a lot that's been so wonderful about having the book out, but one of them is just hearing responses from readers, and many of them here in the States that just say how how much they feel like they relate to the characters and just know the characters, right? Which is
Yeah.
this, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing of power of fiction, is the ability to pull you in and make you feel, get to walk alongside people, and feel like you know them, even when their lives are so different. I was, especially, we're talking with the Wild China crowd, we can't travel, or it's a lot harder to travel now, but we can read. And that's been
Yeah.
something, just to hear that kind of feedback from people has been wonderful.
Yeah, that's exactly why we do these book talks. But we can't travel. This is another way to have a glimpse of the country, right? And so it's interesting you say a lot of Western audience find these characters relatable. I have a question specifically on the characters you chose.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you practically chose the ones who are lost in the sea of people. It's like they are really, really common people. There's a college kid who likes video games, a country girl who goes to sell flowers in the big city, some migrant from China coming here, enters academia, and all these are just like normal, common people. But you have a way to see the details that shape their characters. And so why did you decide to write about these very, very common people's lives?
I mean, they were really, it is funny, I think they were the voices that were most accessible in so many ways, right? Like,
Yeah.
in my own day-to-day life, like, you'll notice, I mean, there is one government bureaucrat, like a male one, and a young woman who works at a very, very low level, but you're not meeting high level party officials in this book. And there's a reason, because I don't know their voices so well. Whereas I felt like a lot of the other voices that I'm channeling, whether it's, again, like, yeah, these young college students, or rural inventors, like just people whose voices I could hear so much more clearly in my head, and felt like I knew, the environment, had spent time in people's homes and in their, in their workplaces, talking about relationship and being in love, and ambitions and all that. And whereas I felt like, for certain parts of Chinese society, it was just harder to access. And so that's why you don't find any sort of top party officials in this book, but you will meet people that remind me very much of the ones that I was able to get to know well in my time.
You definitely, I mean, reading the stories, your affection for these people just like come through clearly. Now, your background, though, is very different from theirs. So I'm going to go there a little bit. This will be my last question from me, but anyone with questions, I know Kendra has one, we can address in Zoom. Otherwise, we're going to jump to Clubhouse soon. So this question is, tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Oakland, and sort of how your parents' relationship with you, about China and reading. I know you read The Monkey King and all that, how that shaped shaped your identity.
Yeah. I mean, for me, China was this really mythologized place, like, and a place that was, I always thought of in a very distant way as home. Even though, of course, I was born in the States, but born in a family that spoke a lot about, the country, and the sense of attachment, and the feeling, of pride, and the sense of history, this historical sweep, and a feeling of family legacy, like, and talked a lot about Hainan, like, in our pride in being from Hainan, the Hawaii of China and the South. I'm sure probably a number of your followers have been. We went to bilingual school. I went to Chinese Saturday school, and so for me, it was like it occupied a large part of my mind growing up, and yet, I didn't go until I was a college student, in 2006, and at that point, it was just such an alienating experience, because, what I realized, of course, very starkly, being in the country for the first time as a student, was how the country was no longer, obviously, it bore no resemblance to the one that I had heard about growing up in the area, of course, and wandering through the Beijing hutongs, looking for one like, my grandmother had been raised in, and of course they were mostly razed at that point, or being in the process of being torn down, and just that profound feeling of dislocation. And I think, for me as a journalist, in the years that I was based in Beijing, of course, and also just personally, I lived in Chengdu and Harbin at other points. I mean, just trying to piece together, just to try and understand the country on its own terms, in a radically different context than, of course, my family's roots had, they'd left the country long ago. And so I'm so pleased to hear you say, that you felt that affection come through for the characters, because
Totally.
that really is a lot of what animated the writing, I think, was, this feeling that, a number of the stories of really wanting to pay tribute to the kinds of people that I met in China, that fierce sense of inventiveness and creativity and drive and resilience that you stumble across so frequently. And I hope, of course, there's politics in the book too, but I hope that picture, like with all of its complexity and nuance and beauty too, also comes through.
And I muted myself to pour myself some hot water. No, absolutely. Okay, so I want to give Kendra a chance. Kendra was very into your book, and she actually recommended your book. So I want to give her a chance to ask a particular question about the title of the book.
Please, yeah.
Cool. Hi, Te-Ping. So yeah, the title of the book, which is also one of the stories, Land of Big Numbers, was one of my favorite stories. I think because for me, like a lot of the stories were very like tied to China. I lived in China for 6 years. So a lot of them were like so reminiscent of things that I experienced through my friends, through just living there. But I feel like Land of Big Numbers, it wasn't until sort of partway through that I really like sort of separated it from the rest of the world, because I felt like that sort of drive for investment and getting interested in stocks is something that's been super prevalent like everywhere, especially with the rise of Robinhood and like cryptocurrencies. So like this sort of like transcending class, and it's not just sort of like the upper class people that are investing anymore. So I found that really interesting. But I like the bit in Land of Big Numbers where you talked about how they have this like faith in the government, that like the government will take care of them financially. And when I was talking to May about it, I was like, that's not something that I feel in America. Like, this is my opinion growing up in America, is that we would never like rely on the government to take care of us financially. And so May and I had totally different takeaways from that story. So I just wanted to ask sort of like your opinion on that. Is that something that came into play when you were writing it? Sort of what was your inspiration for that story?
Yeah, well, the inspiration for that story was I was sitting in a small restaurant and overheard a couple guys talking about a story quite similar to what Land of Big Numbers features, the title story, about a government bureaucrat who was speculating in the stock market with money he'd stolen from the government, but the market kept going up and up and up, and he kept putting the money back, so he wasn't technically stealing, and they thought it was like a really clever idea. And I just sat there and was left wondering, who is this guy, and what ultimately happened to him? And of course, I never found out. This was just a passing conversation I overheard, but it stayed with me, and so that's how the story evolved. And I mean, the story is, of course, so much about like a young man's sense of his own masculinity and self-worth and desire to really find his place in the world and distinguish himself, and also keep up with his friend, who's you see that competitive relationship sort of unfold, and getting caught up in this sense of the excitement of and ease of investing online and getting it over his head and all of that. But to me, also, the story is really about his relationship with his father. His father, who he looks down on as this member of the older generation, has kind of been left behind by this new economy. He doesn't understand stocks. He doesn't understand what Zhu Feng, his son, is doing. And you see too that sort of bifurcated lens through which they see the government, right? Like to Zhu Feng, he's seen state media cheer on the stock market, and he has this real sense of confidence that the market is going to continue to go up and up and up, and he has this faith because it tracks with what he's seen so far. Whereas his father has seen the government, play a very different role in his life. And so that to me was what was, the story's about, so many things, but to me, like, I think that's the real heart of the story, is that sense of idealism that they both have, both generations, in really different ways, and how it runs up against each other, and how they misunderstand each other and love each other. And then ultimately, you can see how Zhu Feng's ambition and desires, sort of lead to more cracks in that relationship.
I'll tell you what I see in that book.
Yeah.
In that story, I see my family.
Say more.
Yeah. It's just like so many people invest in the stock market, right? And then they're like, oh, things are going to be just going up, 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 up. And then does it really pan out that way? There's a lot of the same kind of relationships between kids and parents and all of that. Right. So very interesting. Here's a question from submitted in our Q&A. Is the government satisfaction hotline service does it really exist?
That's a good question.
And then we'll go to the Clubhouse.
Great. Yeah. So that's one story that was definitely inspired by something that I had run into in my reporting. I was so fascinated by these hotlines that existed. There were hotlines that the government had set up, and many cities now have them. I think Shandong was like an early pioneer. You can call and you can make your complaint. You can tell them what whatever it is that's bothering you, and someone will pick up the phone and perhaps try and help you remedy it. And it's these sorts of hotlines that sort of they serve a lot of functions. One of which is to monitor sort of public sentiment in China. Allows officials to sort of have a sense of where the problems are, right, and to address them. And it always, it's a fascinating institution, right, because I think from a distance, of course, that's something that has surprised a lot of readers, the fact that these sorts of institutions might exist in China. And I thought the inherent drama, I was just imagining being someone working in the center, right, and you're picking up, dozens of these calls a day, and what would happen, if suddenly, like, your ex-boyfriend, who you thought you left a long time ago, started calling. That was sort of the genesis, and yes, it wasn't something real.
Yeah, I've seen similar sort of satisfaction hotlines for complaints or businesses or whatever. Okay, one last question. We'll address it. The title "Land of Big Numbers," along with the stories about people being silenced and disappearing, suggests a point of view that people in China are more than just numbers. Is that the case?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. No, I'm glad you asked that question, and that absolutely is what I hope comes across in this book, right? It's just all these individual stories that I think ultimately, are the ones, like, when I think about, what I found so compelling in my time in China, and it's the individual stories, right? The people who amaze you, who surprise you, and who teach you things. And I certainly felt like I learned so much in my years there, and feeling from a distance, like, so much of the China story is told through the government. It's told through sort of this wider lens of the trade war and diplomacy and sort of White House, Zhongnan high relations. And for me, as a reporter and also as a fictioner, what fascinates me is really, those personal human stories, which I think animate so much of, any country, but especially I think when we think about China's future, right, it's so important to look beyond kind of like, the bigger script that is laid out by the government, and to focus also on the individuals and their stories that are ultimately the ones that are I think that do continue the seeds for the country's future.
Yeah, that was a good story. Good question from the audience. Same thing when I travel. It's the individual stories that really sort of bring the countries of the multi-dimensions, the complexity and the beauty sort of really jump through the individuals, right? Thank you.